On October 6, 1887, dawn in Sage Hollow, Wyoming Territory, arrived at 19 degrees, with frost drawn thick on pump handles and the rail spur ringing like struck iron under boot heels. The settlement held 312 souls strung along one wagon road, a church with plain pine benches, a schoolhouse with 2 stoves and thin walls, a mercantile that served as bank and rumor mill, and a scatter of frame houses set too proudly above ground for a country that tested every claim men made against winter. Smoke rose straight for 1 hour, then bent north under a hard wind that smelled of old snow somewhere beyond the ridges. By breakfast, drovers were already arguing over hay prices and freight schedules, as if weather could be bargained with like cattle. Along the ditch behind the Holloway place, 18-year-old Russell Holloway pressed a carpenter square into the soil and marked the frost line in a ledger with neat, narrow script, while her younger brother counted paces between fence posts and spoke temperatures aloud as she wrote them down. In Sage Hollow, that habit made her an object of amusement. She was known less as a ranch daughter than as the girl who measured cold as if it were dead. Yet the measurements had a lineage older than the town itself. Their mother, Anja Holloway, had come west from Finnish winter country with hands that had salted fish in darkness and stacked birch for seasons when roads vanished. She taught her children that timber could split, stoves could fail, and pride could blind. But earth held steady if a person respected depth, draft, and moisture. Through lambing nights and blizzards that rattled every nail in the roof, she repeated one practical law until both children could recite it in one breath. Below the cruel swings of air, the ground kept close to 55 degrees, not warm but survivable, and survivable mattered most. Anya died in the spring of 1885 after a fever that moved too quickly for herbs and too far from doctors to forgive distance. The grave stood on a small rise west of the goat shed, marked by a field stone and her full name cut by Russell with a borrowed chisel. The chain of knowledge did not end there. Anya had learned cellar craft from her father near Oulu, then altered it in Dakota winters before marriage carried her farther west. She passed each method to Russell and Eli by repetition and work. How to read air movement by lantern flame, how to cut vent shafts with a slight fall to drain condensation, how to seal seams with clay and straw when lime cost too much, how to stack food by expected spoilage and not by convenience. The lessons were never spoken as romance. They were spoken as arithmetic. By January 1887, another grave had to be dug. Their father, Thomas Holloway, took pneumonia after hauling feed through 3 days of blowing snow, and he died within a week with debts unsettled and taxes due at county office. His death did not break the land at once. It loosened its hold. 6 acres of thin soil, 1 clapboard house, 2 milk goats, and a weathered shed remained. But unpaid taxes invited men who treated paper as a stronger force than weather and grief combined. Russell and Eli kept the place running through spring by selling eggs, mending harness, and cutting wood for neighbors at 50 cents a load. They paid what they could. It was not enough. The one person who understood their arithmetic was Eli, 13 years old, long-limbed, sharp-eyed, and already carrying himself like someone older because there was no choice in the matter. He rose before first light to break ice from buckets, split kindling, and walk the ditch line with Russell while she read signs others dismissed. When geese shifted early, she noted date and direction. When caterpillars showed thicker dark bands, she marked that too. When the beaver dam on Cotton Run stood a hand higher than the year before, she made a separate entry and underlined it once. Eli did not laugh. He held the lantern and listened. By the second week of February 1888, county notices were posted at the mercantile door. In March, land agent Horace Kincaid arrived in a pressed waistcoat and polished boots that stayed clean because others had to step aside in mud. He had pale gloves, a brass watch chain, and the confidence of a man whose losses usually belong to someone else. At public auction, he purchased the Holloway parcel for $127, then folded the sheriff writ and told the small crowd, loud enough for every bystander near the hitching rail, that if Russell Holloway wished to live like a burrowing animal, she might do it on the badger strip beyond the creek where no proper house ought stand. The remark drew tight laughter, then open laughter, then repetition over days until it traveled farther than the legal notice itself. They were driven off at 18 and 13 with 2 wagons, 1 mule, crates of tools, jars saved from 3 seasons, seed potatoes wrapped in sacking, and stone reclaimed from their own chimney. Russell did not argue in the street. She asked the sheriff for 2 hours to remove the stoveplate and hinges, and when he granted it, she worked with a speed that turned sorrow into sequence. Pry, stack, tie, load, count. Eli kept tally in charcoal on a fence board, so nothing was lost. They crossed the creek by dusk and reached a 1/4 acre of cut-bank ground that could be leased for $3 a month because it held little value for grazing and less for vanity. The site contained an abandoned root cellar dug years earlier by trappers, half collapsed, 6 feet below grade at its deepest point, with a narrow throat lined in rotten planks and 1 broken vent. Most settlers saw only damp earth and trouble. Russell saw mass, slope, and possibility. She stood at the entrance, placed her hand against the wall, and took a reading with no instrument but memory. Then she gave Eli dimensions to stake in the dirt, 16 feet by 22 for the main chamber, 10 feet below grade, hatch offset to the east to reduce direct wind pressure, and trench lines for future auxiliary shelters if winter turned hard. Kincaid named the work Holloway Folly before the first week ended. He repeated it at the mercantile counter while weighing sugar and lamp chimneys, and by Sunday it had reached the church committee and the railmen unloading flour. Younger ranch hands rode out to look, grinning from saddles, and declared the hole would flood in spring and suffocate in winter. Kincaid promoted frame additions instead, lightly built and quickly raised, financed at interest rates that looked manageable in fair weather and ruinous in a long freeze. Russell listened without reply while she measured timber and marked cuts with blue chalk. From late March into April, the project advanced by method rather than speed. They set a double timber collar at the entrance with 12 by 12 reclaimed beams, pinned by oak pegs and backed with stone so thaw could not warp the frame. They cleared old soil to stable walls, then deepened in 2-foot lifts, shoring each section before cutting the next, because haste killed more builders than storms did. Ventilation became the first major expenditure. 2 shafts, each 8 inches wide, 1 intake low and 1 exhaust high, both fitted with oak baffles that could be adjusted by season. The baffles cost $4.75 from a carpenter in Deerfield, who did not ask questions if payment was in coin. The fieldstone throat took 9 days. Eli ferried stone in a handcart, while Russell laid each course in lime mortar, mixed 1 part lime to 3 parts sand, then finished joints with clay where cracks appeared. She gave the passage a downward bend before the inner door, so wind could not drive straight into the chamber. They purchased iron hinges for $18, heavy enough to hold a lineman under freeze and thaw, and stretched canvas strips over door edges to reduce draft leakage. Lime cost $41 across 3 wagon loads. Canvas cost $9. Every figure entered the ledger with date, seller, and purpose. Nothing was guessed. One afternoon, as Eli held the second hatch in place and waited for her mark line, 2 men at the fence called out the nickname again and asked when she planned to move underground for good. Russell set her level, checked plumb twice, and answered without turning her head. Let them talk. Words do not hold heat. Eli repeated the line once that evening while cutting pegs by lantern light, not as bravado, but as instruction. By the first week of May 1888, the outline of the so-called folly had become unmistakable. A chamber that had been a collapsed pit now held straight walls, reinforced corners, and the first signs of a system designed not for comfort, but endurance. Above them, Sage Hollow continued to build for appearances and borrowed time. Below grade, Russell and Eli built for winter that had not yet arrived. Russell marked the next cut line on the earthen wall, handed Eli the short spade, and told him to shave only the dark layer until the lighter clay appeared, because the darker soil held roots that would wick moisture into any seam left untreated. He worked in steady strokes while she knelt near the entrance throat and checked airflow with a tallow candle, watching the flame bend toward the high vent and then settle upright when she closed the oak baffle halfway. Outside, the wind still carried spring cold, but inside the chamber the temperature held at 53 degrees by her mercury tube, and that number governed every choice they made. Over the next 10 days, they built the interior as if it were a vessel meant to cross bad water. Russell set cedar posts on flat stones to lift the main shelf frames 3 inches above floor level, then ran cross braces every 20 inches so loaded jars would not buoy the planks. Eli cut pine boards to uniform lengths and planed each edge smooth enough that burlap sacks could slide without tearing. They laid brick flues in 2 low runs beneath future bunk platforms, not to create heat from nothing, but to conserve what little cooking heat and body warmth a crowded room could produce. The brick cost $6.40 from a kiln 18 miles south, hauled in by wagon over rutted ground that broke 1 axle pin before noon and cost another 35 cents in repairs. By late May, Sage Hollow had entered planting weather, and the town's attention moved between calf losses, seed prices, and the rumor that rail freight from Cheyenne would arrive light again. Russell and Eli worked from dawn until lantern light, pausing only to water the mule and turn the goats onto rough grass along the bank. She mixed seam plaster in a barrel, 2 parts clay to 1 part chopped straw, with a cup of ash added for binding when the clay came up too slick. Eli pressed the mixture into wall joints with a wooden float and sealed each finished seam under a hand-width strip of canvas, dipped in lime wash. Their hands stayed white with dried slurry from wrist to elbow. In the first week of June, Russell added drainage that no one would praise because no one would see it when winter came. She dug a shallow French trench around the uphill side of the cellar and filled it with fist-sized stone, topped by coarse sand, then set a ceramic drain tile with a slight fall toward the creek cut, so thaw water would pass the structure instead of pressing against it. Tile and transport together cost $11.20. At the mercantile counter, 2 ranch wives watched her count out coins and asked whether she planned to irrigate turnips underground. The clerk laughed. Kincaid, standing by the scales with his gloves tucked beneath his arm, answered for her. "She is building a grave for common sense," he said, his voice carrying as if he were reading a notice. "When spring runoff fills Holloway Folly to the rafters, perhaps she will charge admission so school children may inspect the cost of stubbornness." No one challenged him. Men who owed him on notes looked down at their boots. Women with credit at his store looked toward the sugar bins as if they had not heard. Russell took her receipt, folded it once, and placed it in the ledger without speaking. Eli loaded the tile onto the wagon, jaw tight, and waited until they had crossed the creek before he asked if silence would always be the price of staying in town. Russell checked the mule traces and answered with the same calm she used for measurements. "Silence is cheaper than rage, and today we need money for hinges." In July, the chamber received its second door, an inner hatch built from doubled pine boards with wool felt packed between layers and edges wrapped in tarred canvas. Russell hung it on strap hinges and installed a drop bar that could be set from inside. even with gloves on. She tested closure 40 times over 2 days, adjusting latch bite by fractions of an inch until wind no longer whispered through the seam. Then she and Eli built 2 narrow sleeping alcoves into the north wall, each bunk raised above floor damp by stone piers and lined with straw ticks sewn from flour sacks. There was no ornament. There was method. Horace Kincaid continued to prosper through summer heat. He wore broadcloth coats even in July, carried a silver-headed cane more suited to a city boardwalk than a dirt street, and stood in the church vestibule after services shaking hands with men whose debts passed quietly through his desk. His face was smooth, his beard trimmed close, and his boots remained polished because he paid others to handle mud. Under his influence, the church committee declined Russell's request to store 2 communal water barrels in the vestibule for winter emergencies. The decision was phrased as concern for order. Everyone understood it as censure. By the second week of August, Russell shifted from construction to stocking. She bought bulk hard red wheat in 100-pound sacks, 6 in total at $2.10 each, and carried them to the cellar on a hand sledge to spare the mule an afternoon heat. She purchased dried beans, salt, lamp oil, and nails in measured quantities, recording weight, cost, and expected duration for 4, 8, and 12 occupants. Eli built shelving labels with charcoal marks by family size: 2 souls, 4 souls, 6 souls. At first, the labels were only an exercise in arithmetic. Soon they became a plan. At the water pump near the rail spur, boys repeated the nickname Holloway Folly as if it were a song. At the barbershop porch, one teamster said Russell was provisioning for a siege no sky had announced. Another answered that weather signs belonged to old wives and trappers, not to respectable trade. Kincaid encouraged the derision with an easy hand, telling younger ranch hands that rail service had never failed Sage Hollow through a full winter, and that prudent households should invest in above-ground additions, not holes in the creek bank. He sold lumber on credit at terms that looked generous in sunlight. Russell and Eli answered mockery with labor. They rendered tallow candles and dipped wicks until they had 92 usable lights, each wrapped in paper against damp. They smoked strips of goat meat over low cottonwood, rotating racks every 2 hours so no edge burned bitter. They repaired 3 chipped jars and discarded 7 cracked ones rather than trust them with winter stores. By the end of August, 480-quart jars stood in ordered rows. Potatoes, beets, carrots, beans, rendered fat, and broth reduced thick for transportable nourishment. Eli took pride in straight lines. Russell took pride in margins of safety. 3 days after the first September frost, she rode before dawn to check Cotton Run and found the beaver dam raised nearly another half-hand since spring. Geese crossed overhead in a low wedge earlier than the previous 2 years, and cattle in the south pasture stood with their flanks angled to a north breeze that had not yet sharpened. At noon, she measured pressure fall on her barometer tube and entered the number in ink. That evening, while mending rope by lamplight, she told Eli to begin memorizing routes by touch, not sight. Cellar to church, cellar to schoolhouse, cellar to mercantile. Each distance counted in paces and marked by fixed posts where a man could tie off a line in dark weather. He repeated each route until he could recite turn points without looking at the page. Then they set hemp lifelines from the cellar door to the first windbreak post, from that post to a second near the creek bend, and from there toward open ground leading townward. Russell braided loop knots every 6 feet so gloved hands could move along the rope without slipping. Hemp and iron stakes cost $7.85. Eli drove the stakes with a sledge and tamped each base with gravel, testing pull strength by leaning his full weight backward until the lines sang. By early October 1888, nights had dropped below 20 degrees again, and men at the mercantile began discussing coal allotments as if this winter would mirror the last. Russell came in for lamp chimneys and canvas repair strips. Kincaid was there, reviewing account books with one clerk and advising another to extend credit against spring calves. He lifted his gaze when she approached, then spoke loud enough for the room. "Have you brought us a weather sermon, Miss Holloway? Perhaps the earth whispered a prophecy through your burrow wall." Russell placed coins on the counter one by one. "I have brought payment," she said, "and a request that you stock more coarse salt and kerosene in small tins. Families will need both if freight slows." Kincaid smiled without warmth. "Freight does not slow because geese fly early. It slows when drifts take the line and teams cannot find road markers," she replied. He turned away before she finished and told the clerk to ring the sale. The room followed his example and resumed talking of grain, cards, and wages. In the third week of October, she changed the cellar layout from household use to communal contingency. Eli helped her clear one wall for emergency bedding and stack spare blankets in waxed bundles. She dug 2 auxiliary trench shelters beside the main chamber, each 4 feet deep and roofed with poles, brush, and packed earth, meant for overflow bodies when interior air grew too damp. They installed a strict hatch routine on paper: open 30 seconds, close 2 minutes, rotate by whistle. No exception. Eli copied the rules in a larger hand and nailed the board by the entrance where lantern light could catch it. On November 14th, 1888, noon reached 46 degrees under a sky so pale it looked washed, and several townsmen declared winter broken before it had properly begun. Russell took one reading at noon and another just after dusk, then stared at the column for a full half-minute before she capped the tube. The next dawn dropped to -12 with a sharp pressure fall and a north wind that rose like a tool being drawn across stone. She saddled the mule at first light and rode to town with frost stiff in her collar, speaking first at the churchyard, then at the school steps, then in the mercantile doorway. "A multi-week blizzard can lock freight and erase road lines," she said to each group. "Bring water indoors. Move fuel under cover. Keep rope between house and outbuilding. If you need trench plans, Eli and I will mark them today." Some listened and looked away. Others laughed to hide unease. Kincaid dismissed her forecast before a knot of ranch hands by tapping his cane against the hitch rail and declaring that panic was worse than weather and that rail resupply would continue on schedule. He urged households to buy coal and flour on his credit rather than waste labor digging in frozen ground. By sundown, Russell had abandoned persuasion for preparation. She and Eli relabeled every shelf by family size, filled additional water crocks, and hung route maps by the hatch. Outside, the wind turned north and stayed there. Russell stood beneath the hatch awning until the lantern flame steadied, then sent Eli for the chalkboard and rewrote the intake schedule for severe cold. Lower vent 1/4 open, upper vent 1/8. Check candle burn every 2 hours. Clear frost from baffle pins with warm cloth and never with bare fingers. Eli copied the figures in his tighter hand onto a second board for the auxiliary trench shelters. They worked by lamplight until near midnight, adding wool felt strips around the inner hatch and tacking them down with short copper nails so the seals would not split under repeated opening. The chamber held at 52 degrees, while the outside air fell through the teens. By first light on November 15th, they had shifted from provisioning to occupancy engineering. Russell measured floor space with a line cord and marked sleeping lanes in lime. Adults along the west wall where the brick flues passed, children in the inner rows where drafts were weakest, elders nearest the cookshelf and water crocks to reduce night movement. Eli built 3 bucket stands from scrap pine, each 12 inches high, and bored drain holes so meltwater from boots could be separated from drinking stores. Russell set sanitation rules in plain script beside the hatch: 1 lime scoop per use, lids closed, carry out only in daylight, no exceptions for status. She did not speak that last line aloud, but Eli noticed and said nothing. The project grew in forms that looked unremarkable until one counted what each form solved. They rigged a handrail rope from the entrance throat to the main floor, so anyone descending in darkness could keep balance even with swollen fingers. They added a heat curtain of doubled canvas inside the outer door, weighted with scrap chain links, which cut draft loss each time the hatch opened by nearly half according to her candle test. They stacked emergency rations in strict sequence by spoilage and caloric return. Broth reduction jars first, then beans, then wheat porridge mix in cloth sacks pre-weighed at 2 pounds for 6 souls. Every shelf bore both volume and day count. No guesswork remained. On the afternoon of November the 15th, Russell sent Eli to drive 2 additional windbreak posts at the open ground approach, while she dug a shallow ash pit beside the cook station to reduce interior moisture from boiling. She tested roof load tolerance by setting weighted sand sacks across the overhead timbers in 20-pound increments until they reached 400 pounds across the central span, then adjusted one support with a wedge cut from oak. Eli returned with his mittens stiff from rime and reported that the first rope line already hummed in steady gusts. Russell answered by handing him warm broth and assigning the next task before he had finished the cup. Knot flags at 12-pace intervals from post 3 to post 5, so travelers could track distance by touch. The town watched these preparations and gave them meaning that fit its pride. At the mercantile porch, Kincaid told a circle of teamsters that Holloway Folly had become Holloway Barracks, and that Russell now fancied herself quartermaster to a war no one had declared. His cane tapped each board as he spoke, and men laughed because laughter kept them in his favor. Later that same evening, when Eli went in for lamp wicks, 2 clerks delayed him at the counter while serving others who had arrived later, then asked whether the cellar had room for goats and mules too, since he appeared intent on moving all creation underground. Eli paid in exact coin and left with fewer wicks than requested because the clerk claimed the crate was low, though full boxes sat behind him in plain view. By November 16th, mockery had moved from talk to policy. The church committee posted winter use guidelines excluding private storage in vestibule and cellar spaces, a decision aimed at Russell even after she stopped asking. Kincaid offered discounted coal contracts to households willing to sign through his office before sundown, warning that panic buyers would pay double after the first heavy snow. Families lined up with hats in hand. Several had little cash and signed anyway. Russell crossed the street with a list of rope lengths and asked one carpenter if he would sell her 6 more iron rings for anchor points. He glanced toward Kincaid's window, then said he had no stock. She thanked him, bought salvaged harness rings from a farrier instead, and filed each ring edge smooth to prevent glove tears during whiteout travel. Near dusk, a pair of ranch hands rode past the cut bank and called down that she should paint a sign reading "Finest Borough in Wyoming Territory." One threw a turnip that struck the bank and rolled to Eli's boots. Russell picked it up, cut away the bruised side, and added the rest to the stew pot. The gesture traveled almost as quickly as the insult. By night, some in town repeated it as proof she felt no shame. Others repeated it as proof she had none to spare. Kincaid began referring to her in ledgers as the cellar tenant, rather than by name. Clerks followed suit. 3 days passed before the pressure dropped again, and each day sharpened the divide between preparation and appearance. Russell kept Eli on timed drills, running route lines with scarf over his eyes to force reliance on rope knots and pace count. He moved from cellar to first post in 42 paces, second post in another 37, creek bend marker in 26, then back blindfolded with only 1 miss. She corrected his hand placement at each loop knot and made him repeat until he could do it without pause. Inside, She packed medical shelf bins by symptom and severity: fever broth, willow bark, bandage cloth boiled and dried, pine tar salve, lamp oil measured into small tins so no family would consume a month's supply in one night of fear. On November the 17th, dawn broke under a high pale lid of cloud with a faint ring around the sun, and the air carried that dry metallic edge Russell had entered in her ledger before previous hard blows. Cattle in lower pasture refused open ground and bunched tight against lee fences. Dogs that usually chased wagon wheels stayed under porches and would not be called out. At Cotton Run, the creek lip glazed over by midday despite running water beneath, and wind had begun to lift surface snow from old drifts in long, low streamers that moved east even when the upper gusts crossed from north. Russell showed Eli each sign, named each sign, and made him repeat the sequence as if reciting scripture. She went to town one last time with no speech prepared and no expectation of welcome. At the schoolhouse, she left a folded page with route instructions and hatch protocol on the teacher's desk because the building emptied early on, account of cold. At the blacksmith shed, she told Aaron Vale to keep one rope from door to coal stack if weather thickened at night. He nodded and said he would. At Kincaid's store, she requested only this: that he post a notice advising families to fill every indoor vessel with water before dark. Kincaid stood behind barrels of flour and answered in a voice pitched for the room, "I will not conduct business by almanac fear. If you wish to alarm your own household, do so beyond my door." She placed a blank notice card on the counter anyway, wrote in her clean, narrow script, "Fill water now. Rope your path. Do not walk alone after dusk," and left it there. One cleric turned the card face down as soon as she stepped away. By late afternoon, the light had thinned to pewter, though sunset remained hours away. Eli had already hauled 2 extra crocks to the inner wall and was shaving candle stubs to reuse every inch of wick. Russell checked each vent pin, each latch, each shelf tie. She assigned inventory by voice while he recorded: wheat, 5 sacks full and 1 opened; beans, 3 sacks and 11 jars cooked; salt, 41 pounds; lamp oil, 12 gallons in sealed tins; cottonwood, 1 1/2 cords dry under oilskin, and a 1/4 cord kindling at hand. Then she added a line not in the old ledger format: probable occupancy if town fails, 30 to 40 souls in main chamber, plus trenches. Eli paused with pencil raised, then wrote the number. After sundown, social pressure hardened into open exclusion. 2 boys from town came to the cut bank on Dares and shouted that Kincaid had said no respectable family would crawl into that hole unless forced at gunpoint. They ran when Eli stepped outside with the lantern. Later, a deacon from church stopped at the upper path and called down that panic had become contagious and that Russell should cease frightening mothers with talk of roads erased and freight halted. She invited him to inspect the rope routes and occupancy plan. He declined, citing supper hour, and warned that disorder began when young persons forgot their station. Russell thanked him for coming and returned to sealing jar lids with wax. Near midnight, the first hard grains struck the hatch like thrown sand. By then, the wind measured stronger than 50 miles per hour on her improvised van count, and every gust carried finer ice that found skin through cloth seams. She woke Eli from his bunk and set watch rotations at 2 hours each, so one could rest while the other checked vents and exterior lines. He took first watch and came back with eyebrows frosted white, reporting drift buildup knee-deep at post 2 and rising. Russell sent him to warm by the stoveplate while she went out tethered to the main rope, shovel on shoulder, and cut a channel from hatch to windbreak so the entrance would not seal over before morning. On the morning of November 18th, the storm had not yet reached full violence, but road markers were already disappearing one by one, fence lines blurring into a single white grade with sky and ground nearly indistinguishable at 50 yards. Russell and Eli moved without wasted words. They set the outer warning bell on a short pull rope, tested the whistle code for hatch rotation, and hung spare mittens in numbered pairs near the door. Russell wrote one final board and nailed it by the throat entrance where any arriving soul would see it even through blowing powder. Enter fast, sit low, share heat, follow Eli if told. The instruction carried no plea and no anger, only sequence. By noon, wagon noise from town had ceased entirely. Even the rail spur, usually ringing under metal and wind, lay under a growing ridge of drift with no sound but the long, hard rush of air across open ground. Inside the cellar, temperature held at 51 degrees. Outside, the world narrowed to rope, post, and whiteness. Russell wrapped her scarf higher, handed Eli the second lantern, and opened the hatch to the storm. The hatch swung outward against a force that felt less like weather than machinery, and wind drove fine ice through the throat in a white stream that hissed when it struck the warm iron of the stoveplate. Russell stepped onto the cut channel with one hand on the main rope and the other shielding the lantern glass, then lowered the hatch behind her until only a narrow seam remained, because an open door would empty heat faster than any fire could replace it. Eli followed to the threshold, counted her paces to post one, and rang the warning bell twice, so any soul in the near dark would know the route was active. By mid-afternoon on November 18th, visibility had collapsed to less than 30 yards. Fence lines vanished first, then wagon ruts, then the black shapes of cottonwoods along the creek, until Sage Hollow appeared not as a town, but as scattered sounds inside a moving wall. Russell and Eli worked the ropes in alternating runs, carrying no one yet, only checking anchors and cutting drifts away from knot loops so frozen mittens could still find purchase. At post 3, one iron ring had begun to wrench sideways under wind load. Russell drove a second stake beside it and lashed both with doubled hemp, then packed snow hard around the base to lock the set. When she reached the cellar again, her scarf had iced at the mouth, and her eyelashes held white beads that did not melt for several minutes indoors. Night arrived before the hour suggested it should, and with darkness came the first failures above ground. One by one, stovepipes lost draft as crosswinds forced smoke back into rooms. Men climbed roofs with lanterns to clear caps, slipped on rime, climbed again, and by 9 o'clock many had abandoned attempts at repair and fed their stoves with damp wood that burned fast and gave little. Eli logged arrivals and conditions on a slate by the hatch as instructed, though no arrivals had yet come. Wind sustained above 50 miles per hour. Drift at post 2 waist high. Outer bell line still clear. Russell kept interior discipline exact. Every 2 hours, baffles were checked. Every opening was timed. Every pot of broth was covered between ladles to hold steam within reason and not soak the ceiling in condensation. At dawn on November 19th, the mercury tube outside the hatch read -26. The storm had strengthened in the night and now carried larger particles that struck timber like thrown gravel. Russell made one townward run tethered at the waist to the main line and found the first row of houses half buried to window level on their north sides. At the church, she beat ice from the latch and pushed the door enough to see 6 families huddled near the stove, with little fuel and no rope between entrance and woodshed. Deacon Mercer shouted through the crack that they were managing. Russell shouted back that managing would not carry through another night. He answered with a nod, but did not move to leave. Pride still held where heat did not. Rail service stopped that same morning. The noon freight whistle never came, and by afternoon the spur lay under drifts deep enough that only the top of one signal post showed above the white. At the Mercantile, Kincaid kept doors open in short intervals and sold coal. flour and lamp oil to whoever could still reach the counter. But travel itself had become the price most could not pay. Shelves that had stood full on Saturday began to show gaps by Sunday evening, and the backroom stock could not be fetched quickly because two clerks were now occupied clearing snow from the entry every quarter hour. Kincaid's broadcloth coat remained clean only from the knee upward. Below that, his trousers were soaked and stiff with ice, and the polished boots that had once marked status now leaked at the seams. By the second evening of the storm, his own house on the rise east of town suffered the insult he had sold to others as certainty. A gust tore the stovepipe collar from the roof and drove snow through the breach in thick gusts. Men tried to reset the pipe with wire and sheet scrap, but wind sheared each attempt loose within minutes. The parlor temperature fell from 40 to near freezing before midnight. His wife and clerks moved mattresses into one room and burned furniture kindling to hold a narrow circle of warmth. Kincaid sent a runner toward the church for spare coal, and the runner returned with none, because the church had none to spare. On November the 20th, the storm entered its third day and its most punishing rhythm. It no longer arrived in surges with brief lulls. It held one relentless pressure from dawn through dark, and the town's light frame additions, erected quickly in fair weather and bought on credit, bled heat through every seam. Families who had trusted thin walls and big stoves discovered that fuel vanished by arithmetic, not by hope. Children were wrapped in quilts beside ovens gone cold by morning. Water buckets froze along room edges by noon. Men who had dismissed rope lines now tied bedsheets between porch posts and sheds, and those improvised lifelines snapped where knots iced and cloth tore. The first named death came before sunrise that day. Lydia Pike, schoolteacher, 34 years old, left her back porch to retrieve split wood, stacked 20 yards from the kitchen door. She had received Russell's route sheet at the schoolhouse and folded it into a reader, but she had no rope set between structures because the prior day had seemed manageable. Neighbors later said they heard her call once, and then no more. When Aaron Vale and his apprentice found her at gray light, she was curled against the drifted fence corner with one glove off and two pieces of kindling still tucked under her arm, as if duty had continued past the point where the body could answer it. They carried her inside and covered her with her own classroom quilt. The stove in that room had gone out an hour earlier. 3 days into the blizzard, Sage Hollow still had no clear road, no rail connection, and no reliable count of who remained safely housed. Russell and Eli began active retrieval at noon on November the 20th, after the first bell pull from Post 4. 2 ranch women arrived together on the line with one elderly uncle between them, half walking and half dragged, faces masked with frost and breath shallow. Eli took them down the throat by handrail, assigned bunks by the west flue, and set hot stones wrapped in cloth at their feet. Russell returned to the rope before her coat had fully thawed. She had built for numbers. Numbers had begun to come. By nightfall, 21 souls occupied the main chamber, and 6 more lay in trench shelter, one under doubled blankets and oilskin. The interior held at 48 degrees despite constant hatch rotations, because procedure was followed and fuel was metered in measured splits rather than panic burns. Outside, houses failed in quiet increments that looked small until they combined. One cracked chimney, one drifted door, one exhausted woodpile, one family waiting 1 hour too long to move. Eli marked each new arrival on the slate and erased no names. Aaron Vale died on the 4th day, November 21st, in the rail yard he had trusted as his winter anchor. He had tied rope from forge to coal stack after Russell's warning, but when the apprentice Thomas Reed slipped near the switch platform and lost his coat in the wind, Aaron gave him his own and pushed him toward the rope line with both hands on the boy's shoulders. Thomas reached shelter and lived. Aaron turned back for a drop tool satchel that carried payroll records and never completed the return. Men found him after dawn against the lee side of a freight crate, knees drawn up, hat brim packed with ice, one hand still closed around the satchel strap, as if accounts owed to workers weighed as much as survival itself. Thomas brought the satchel to the blacksmith shed and set it on the bench without speaking. That same day, Samuel Boone, 9 months old, died before sunset in a North Lane frame house after the stove draft failed, and the room froze faster than his mother could reheat bricks for his cradle. His father had gone out on a sheet line run for coal and was forced back twice by drifts that closed over his tracks within minutes. By the time neighbors reached them with a lantern and a kettle, the child's breathing had already gone shallow and then gone still beneath 3 quilts. They carried him to the church wrapped in a flour sack and wool shawl, and his name passed through town in a whisper that cut sharper than the wind, because no argument about pride or thrift could make sense of it. Food anxiety sharpened into open desperation by the 5th day. The mercantile shelves that had once displayed sacks in neat pyramids now showed bare plank between scattered tins. Kincaid began rationing by account status at first light and abandoned that policy by noon when arguments broke out near the flour barrels. Credit notes became nearly useless because no one could promise spring income if stock died first. Coal bins ran low. Lamp wicks were cut in halves. In several homes, stew pots held more water than grain to stretch portions one meal further. At Russell's Cellar, portions were thin but predictable, and predictability itself became a form of mercy. Help was sought in full on the afternoon of November the 22nd, not by proclamation from leaders but by a single exhausted approach that forced pride to yield. Naomi Bell, telegraph clerk, 19 years old and wrapped in 2 mismatched coats, reached post 5 with Deacon Mercer on her rope and rang the bell with both hands until Eli opened. Her cheeks were white at the edges and her voice failed on the first attempt, then returned in short bursts. "The church cannot hold through another night," she said from the threshold. 28 souls there. 4 elders cannot walk far. We have 1 sack of coal left and wet wood after that. We need your lines. We need your rules. Mercer stood behind her, hat crushed in his fists, snow caked in his beard where breath had frozen and thawed and frozen again. The man who had warned Russell about station now spoke without rank in his tone. "I was wrong to turn away your barrels and your rope plans. I do not ask you to pardon that. I ask you to come." Russell did not answer with reproach and did not pause to weigh old insults against present need. She handed Naomi a cup of broth, instructed Eli to issue mittens and assign 2 warmed escorts, then took the route board from the wall and moved straight to logistics. "We run 3 teams," she said. "1 from church to post 4, 1 from post 4 to hatch, 1 rotating blankets and hot stones. No one walks untethered. Elders first, then children, then those who can carry loads. Eli commands hatch timing. You obey him." Naomi nodded once. Mercer nodded twice like a man relearning motion. Within 10 minutes, the first retrieval team stepped into the white with lanterns hooded and rope loops around their wrists. The storm still struck like a weapon, but now it met structure instead of confusion. At the hatch, Eli rang the bell in measured code, opened on count, closed on count, and called names as each soul descended. Toward dusk, as the line from church steadied and traffic became continuous, another figure appeared beyond post 3, bent nearly double against the wind, flanked by 2 clerks in city coats gone stiff with ice. Even through drift and failing light, the set of his shoulders was recognizable. Horace Kincaid had come to Holloway Folly and was waiting for permission to enter. Russell did not grant him a separate word from the others. She pointed to the handrail rope, then to Eli at the hatch, and spoke over the wind with the same tone she used for inventory counts. "You enter by order of need. clerks first if they are weaker. Keep one hand on the line. Speak only names at the door. Kincaid opened his mouth as if habit would place him first, then closed it when a gust bent him sideways, and one of his clerks stumbled to his knees. Eli reached up, caught the younger clerk by the sleeve, and drew him down the throat. The second followed, then Kincaid last, face gray from cold and pride spent to function. Inside the chamber, steam from broth clouded his spectacles. Russell handed him a tin cup and a blanket without ceremony. He took both with shaking hands and sat where Eli told him to sit, beside men who owed him money and women he had once made wait at his counter. By the morning of November the 23rd, the rescue had become a system running on rope, timing, and obedience rather than rank. Russell kept 3 teams moving between church, schoolhouse, and North Lane houses that still held families with too little fuel to last another night. Eli controlled the hatch interval with a pocket watch that had stopped twice from cold and been restarted over stove heat. 30 seconds open, 2 minutes closed. No exceptions. Naomi Bell took slate tally at the door and read names aloud so no one vanished into confusion. Deacon Mercer carried hot stones wrapped in wool from cook shelf to trench shelter and back until his shoulders failed and another man took his place. Inside, Russell taught while she served. She showed mothers how to place bricks near the flue and wrap them for cradle warmth without scorching cloth. She showed ranch hands how to scrape frost from vent pins with wood, never iron, so metal would not seize. She cut bean rations by body size and labor output, then explained each cut in public so hunger could not turn into rumor. Kincaid watched from his bench as methods he had mocked became rules that held 43 souls at survivable temperature through the worst hours of the storm. The expensive frame additions he had financed stood above drifts with window glass blown in and stovepipes torn away. The chamber built with salvaged timber, clay, and arithmetic held. On the 6th day, a team reached the mercantile itself. Shelves were stripped down to scattered tins, 2 sacks of spoiled flour, and a crate of cracked lamp chimneys. The blank notice card Russell had written and left face down was found beneath the ledger blotter, edges damp but legible. Fill water now. Rope your path. Do not walk alone after dusk. Naomi carried it back in her coat and pinned it beside the hatch rules where every new arrival could read what had been refused and what had proved true. The blizzard broke in fragments, not in mercy. Wind dropped for an hour, rose again, then dropped long enough on November the 29th for men to see roof lines and the church steeple through blown haze. On November 30th, dawn came with weak sun and a temperature of -8, warmer than the previous week by brutal standards. Teams began clearing paths to buried doors and checking outbuildings for stock that could still be saved. Russell sent Eli with Thomas Reed and 2 others to reopen the rope line to the rail spur, then kept the chamber active for those whose homes remained unfit. When the first freight whistle finally sounded on December 2nd, thin and delayed, several in the cellar wept from relief and shame in equal measure. The reckoning did not gather at once into speeches. It arrived in work. On December the 4th, Aaron Vale's apprentice brought back 2 borrowed shovels and asked where to stack split wood for the trench roofs. On December 6th, the ranch wives who had once laughed at drain tile spent a full day packing clay against their own cellar seams under Russell's instruction. Deacon Mercer came each evening for a week to scrub bucket stands and refill lime bins without being asked. Families whose credit accounts had failed began repaying food taken during the storm in labor hours, hauling stone, cutting posts, mending canvas, digging grade away from hatch entrances. Russell accepted each offer as task, not tribute. Kincaid held out longest in public and yielded first in private. 3 days after the thaw, he came alone at dusk with no cane and no gloves, carrying a wrapped bundle of county papers tied in twine. Eli let him in and stayed by the stove while he spoke. Kincaid set the papers on the shelf and kept his eyes on the floorboards. "I named your work Holloway Folly," he said. "I repeated it so often that others forgot your given name. During the storm, I entered under your rules and ate from your stores, while souls I advised suffered for advice I sold as certainty. These are the deed transfer forms for the Holloway parcel, and releases on 2 liens attached after auction. Filing cost is mine. Signature is yours if you choose to take it." Russell untied the twine, read each page by lamplight, and checked seal marks against the county ledger copy she kept in her chest. She did not thank him quickly, and she did not spare him the measure of truth. "Paper took our house in 1 day," she said. "Paper can return it. That does not return Lydia Pike, Aaron Vale, or Samuel Boone. If you seek ease, there is none here." Kincaid nodded once, as if struck by a weight he had expected and still could not bear. "I do not seek ease." Within another week, the wider town followed with words to match its labor. No formal dais was set. No one called it a tribunal. Yet after Sunday service on December 16th, families remained by the church stove rather than dispersing, and one by one they spoke where all could hear. The carpenter who had refused iron rings admitted he had looked toward Kincaid's window before lying. A mercantile clerk confessed he had turned down Russell's warning card and delayed Eli at the counter. 2 ranch hands repeated the insults they had shouted from horseback, and then offered teams to haul earth for communal shelters before next winter. Naomi Bell read from her telegraph log that lines west had been blocked 6 days, then 10, then 11, proving resupply had never been a real plan during the worst stretch. Facts settled where opinion had once strutted. When Kincaid's turn came, he stood with both hands on the pew back in front of him, broadcloth replaced by a plain wool coat still stained at the hem from storm mud. His voice carried, but not with the old performance. "I sold confidence as if weather answered to ledger columns," he said. "I financed walls that looked respectable and failed under stress I was warned to expect. I used influence in this church and this store to isolate the very household that preserved this town. I called her tenant, burrower, folly. During day 7, I stood in her line holding a cup she filled. If you ask whether I was wrong, I was wrong. If you ask whether I am ashamed, I am." Silence held after him, not empty but heavy with names no one could recover. Then eyes turned toward Russell, who had stood near the stove door with Eli beside her, soot on her sleeve from morning repairs, no prepared script in hand. She stepped forward and spoke once, measured and plain. 3 souls are dead. Lydia Pike froze 20 yards from wood she needed for her school children. Aaron Vale gave his coat to a boy and did not return. Samuel Boone died before rescue reached his stove. If this gathering is for comfort, I cannot provide it. If it is for instruction that I can provide. Weather does not sort by pride, church rank, or account size. Build below wind where you can. Store water indoors before every front. Tie rope from door to fuel. Keep shared inventories and shared plans. Teach children the routes in fair light so they can walk them in dark weather. I did not build that cellar for revenge. I built it because my mother taught that survival belongs to those who prepare together. No cheer followed. Instead, men and women took out pencils, scraps, and hymn margins and wrote down each instruction as she gave dimensions, costs, and sequence. Eli moved among them with the slate and repeated measurements in a steady voice. Trench depth, 4 feet. Roof poles no more than 18 inches apart. Vent baffle 1/4 open in severe cold. Bucket lime ratio, 1 scoop per use. The reckoning became a class, and the class became policy. Through January, February, and March of 1889, Russell and Eli taught weekly winter preparation lessons at the church annex, and when space ran short, at the reopened schoolhouse. Attendance was recorded by Naomi Bell. By spring, 87 households had sent at least one adult to 2 or more sessions. Kincaid resigned his council post after County Review exposed predatory note terms during the storm period. He paid filing costs for 23 amended contracts and sold the large Hill House, moving to 2 rooms behind the Mercantile. No one restored his old authority. He no longer asked for it. Russell filed the deed transfer at county office, reclaimed the original Holloway parcel, and chose not to abandon the Cut Bank complex. She kept both sites, the old claim for goats and summer garden, the cellar for winter security and communal storage. The notice card, once turned face down, remained pinned near the hatch, then was copied onto town emergency boards in cleaner script. The ledger she had kept since October 1887 was duplicated by 3 households that had formerly mocked record-keeping. Building like Holloway entered local speech first as a practical instruction and later as praise. Years later, the pattern held. By 1896, Sage Hollow counted 347 souls, and each street contained at least one earth-sheltered food room with vent boards modeled on Russell's drawings. New houses were bermed where grade allowed. Rope posts stood by doors before first frost, not after first panic. At the church, winter committees tracked shared coal and bean stores by family size, rather than social standing. Eli, grown broad-shouldered and exact, inspected hatch seals every October for widows and elders at no charge. Naomi kept weather logs at the telegraph desk and posted pressure drops publicly. The root cellar on the Badger Strip still stands as the warmest room in town. Its walls are marked by years of hands, repairs, and careful additions, not by monument carving. Near the inner hatch, one line is cut into a cedar board in Russell's narrow script, copied from her mother's teaching, and read aloud to each new class before winter. Words do not hold heat. Work does. The children repeated the carved line in uneven chorus, then fell quiet when Russell set a frost-blackened goosewing and a strip of beaver-chewed willow on the table beside her ledger. The schoolhouse stove ticked with heat, and 32 souls sat on benches with pencils ready while snow moved past the windows in thin, dry sheets. Eli stood by the door with a coil of hemp over one shoulder and 4 stakes under his arm. "These are not curiosities," Russell said, touching the wing, then the willow. On November 14th, 1888, geese flew low and early. On September 3rd, the beaver dam at Cotton Run rose another half-hand. Those signs were entered before the pressure fall. You will mark the same signs each autumn, and you will mark date, temperature, and wind direction in full. She opened the old ledger to the blizzard pages and called names from the inventory columns. Wheat issued, 5 sacks and 1 opened, then exhausted by December 2nd. Bean stores reduced to 12 jars by the final church transfer. Lamp oil drawn down to 2 gallons, then restored by freight on December 7th. Invoice attached. Cottonwood reserve cut to 1/4 cord by day 10. Every item that had entered the cellar during preparation now carried an outcome line in red pencil: consumed, returned, replaced, or abandoned with cause. Eli pinned receipt copies to the board in rows, including the filed deed cost Kincaid had paid, the amended contracts from County Review, and the note that 2 cracked lamp chimneys from the Mercantile had been discarded as unsafe. By the second week of January 1889, when another hard front pushed temperatures to -19, the lessons were no longer theory. Bell ropes rang in sequence across Sage Hollow before dusk. Families filled wash basins and kettles indoors. Children tied door lines under supervision instead of waiting for fathers to come in from barns after dark. At the Pike Schoolhouse Annex, Naomi Bell read the telegraph advisory from Rawlins Station that freight would be delayed by drift cuts west of the pass, and no one laughed at the warning this time. Deacon Mercer and 2 ranch hands moved barrel water into church storage without committee argument. The barrels had the Holloway measurements burned into the staves, 40 gallons each, lids wax-sealed, ladles hanging on chain. That night, when wind rose and erased the road between the church and the south lane, the town did not panic and did not scatter. Teams moved by rope in pairs as taught. Eli ran hatch timing at the cut bank for overflow souls whose stoves failed, and he sent each arrival to marked spaces without confusion. Russell stood at the cook shelf with Naomi, thinning porridge to stretch for 43 occupants while still holding caloric weight for children and elders. Kincaid came with a sled of split pine purchased with his own coin and stacked it where Eli directed. No one offered him ceremony. He accepted the absence as just measure. 3 days passed before the wind dropped enough for full accounting. On the church table, Russell laid out the winter board and assigned every borrowed item to a name and date. 27 blankets, 12 shovels, 3 lanterns with cracked chimneys, 4 buckets, 2 iron pots, 1 missing axe head last seen at trench shelter 2. The missing axe head was found by Thomas Reed beneath drifted ash near the auxiliary hatch and returned before dusk. The wool felt strips cut from old coats were too worn to save. They were marked abandoned and then replaced by pooled purchase at $1.60. The rule became written ordinance in town minutes. Nothing leaves communal stores without a ledger line, and no ledger line is closed until replacement or agreed loss is recorded publicly. On February 2nd, 1889, after Sunday service, the reckoning took a sharper shape than apology and longer wait than shame. Families remained in the pews while Naomi read, not from Scripture but from the county packet that had arrived by rail. Findings on usurious note terms issued through Kincaid's office before the blizzard, fees charged above declared rates, and collateral clauses that would have transferred winter failed properties by spring. Kincaid stood to the side of the stove, coat plain, hands empty. When Naomi finished, she folded the packet and set it beside Russell's ledger so both records lay under the same light. The first clerk, Edwin Sloat, stepped forward and spoke with his eyes on the floorboards. He said he had turned Russell's warning card face down because Kincaid had looked at him across the counter and lifted one finger, and he feared losing wages more than he feared weather. He said he had delayed Eli at the wick shelf for the same reason. He then placed $9 on the rail, equal to the canvas cost he had once mocked aloud, and asked that it be used for church rope posts. The second clerk, Harlan Voss, admitted he had told mothers the cellar would suffocate children because he had never entered it and preferred the comfort of repeating authority. He offered 12 days of labor to dig berms for the widows on North Lane. When Kincaid spoke, he did not defend his figures. He named them. He read each inflated percentage and each clause that had hidden seizure terms in fine print, then signed a withdrawal of claim on 8 properties, including 2 already in arrears. He announced the sale of his remaining speculative tract to fund a communal coal reserve and handed the draft to Deacon Mercer for witness signatures. His voice held no request for restoration. "I cannot speak Samuel Boone alive," he said. "I cannot speak Aaron Vale back to his forge. I can stop profiting from the cold that took them." All eyes shifted to Russell. She did not step to the center aisle. She remained beside the stove door where soot darkened her cuff, and she answered from there. "You are asking what to do with guilt," she said. "Keep it long enough to make new habits, then put that weight into work. Do not ask me to call this settled. Lydia Pike is still dead. Aaron Vale is still dead. Samuel Boone is still dead. Their names are not lessons to decorate speeches. Their names are obligations. If you wish to honor them, then each October you will inspect vents, count stores by family size, post weather logs publicly, and train children on rope routes in daylight. You will not leave survival to merchants, to committees, or to luck. I will teach any household that asks, and Eli will inspect any hatch seal brought to him. Whether you name that forgiveness is your own burden. No one clapped. Pencils moved. Mercer wrote the names first, then the obligations under each. By October 1890, Sage Hollow held 329 souls, and the first town-wide drill ran from church bell to final roll call in 43 minutes. Naomi posted pressure, temperature, and wind in chalk at dawn and dusk through winter. Eli carried a satchel of gauges and wax to 20 homes each week, testing latch bite and vent pull with the same candle method their mother had taught. The old Holloway parcel grew potatoes and feed beets again, while the Cutbank complex remained the winter heart of the town, expanded by one new chamber 14 feet long with stone, set by volunteer crews who had once mocked the original work. In 1893, when a rail washout delayed flour for 9 days, there were no deaths in Sage Hollow. Communal shelves opened by ledger rule. Families ate thin but steady. Kincaid, now clerk under town contract rather than private speculator, sat at the annex table and copied inventory lines until his hand cramped, then continued with the other hand. He never recovered his old manner. He did not attempt it. By 1896, with 347 souls in the count, every street held earth-sheltered storage, and the phrase building, like Holloway, carried the same respect as a church blessing. New brides and new ranch hands attended the autumn class as a matter of course. Children could identify geese flight shifts and dam height before they could harness a team. The warning card, once turned face down, was framed beside the church stove, edges still warped from damp, with Naomi's note beneath it. Posted too late in 1888. Posted first since 1889. The root cellar still stands on the Badger Strip, timber darkened by lamp smoke and years of touch, floor worn smooth where boots cued at the hatch through 2 generations of winters. On first frost mornings, Russell and Eli still open the ledger together, and the town still gathers close enough to hear the pencil, scratch as names, numbers, and weather enter the record before the wind turns north.